The check hit the table like a gavel. 53 people staring, not at the number, at me. And my daughter-in-law's smile, that slow, practiced, predatory smile, told me she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. I am Daniel Whitmore. I am 64 years old. I built 3 companies from nothing, buried a wife I loved more than oxygen, raised a son I would die for, and I have never, not once in my entire life, allowed someone to humiliate me at a dinner table. Tonight was not going to be the exception. Let me take you back to where this really started, because stories like this never begin at the moment people think they do. They begin quietly, in kitchens and hallways, in small glances and tiny slights that accumulate like sediment, until one day you find yourself sitting at the bottom of a river wondering how you got there. My son Marcus married Vanessa Holloway 3 years ago in a ceremony that cost more money than my first house. I paid for most of it, not because anyone asked me to, I volunteered, because Marcus was my blood and his happiness was worth every dollar. Vanessa came from a family that had money in the way some families have: bad posture, inherited, comfortable, never truly examined. Her father, Gerald Holloway, was the kind of man who wore his wealth like a cologne. Strong, unavoidable. Slightly nauseating in an enclosed space. From the very beginning, Vanessa made it clear that she found me quaint. That was her word. She used it once at a Sunday dinner, describing my house, the house where Marcus grew up, the house where his mother Margaret died in the bedroom upstairs, the house I had maintained and loved for 31 years, as quaint. Marcus hadn't noticed. He was laughing at something on his phone. I noticed. I always notice. Over 3 years, the slights evolved. First, it was the subtle redirecting of Marcus's time. Holidays rerouted to the Holloway estate. Birthdays reframed as intimate couple experiences that didn't include fathers. Then it was the financial conversations that somehow always circled back to me. How much was my retirement portfolio worth? Had I considered downsizing? Didn't I think it was a bit much, one man alone in that big house? I gave her nothing. I smiled. I deflected. I was patient in the way that only a man who has survived genuine loss can be patient, because I knew the difference between a real problem and an annoying one, and Vanessa Holloway, for all her maneuvering, was merely annoying. Until she stopped being merely annoying. The party was Marcus's 40th birthday. Vanessa planned it entirely, a restaurant buyout at Calvea, which was the kind of French restaurant where the menu had no prices, and the waitstaff spoke to you with their chins slightly elevated. She booked the private dining room, ordered a 7-course tasting menu for 53 guests, arranged a jazz quartet, and had custom floral arrangements shipped in from some boutique in New York. I knew about none of this in advance. Marcus called me 2 weeks before and said, "Dad, Vanessa's throwing me a birthday dinner. You're going to love it. Just show up at 7. That was the entirety of my briefing. I showed up at 7. I wore a good suit, charcoal grey, the one Margaret had picked out for me years ago that still fit because grief has a way of keeping a man thin. I brought Marcus a gift, a first edition copy of a book he'd loved as a teenager, found it at an estate sale and had it rebound in leather. I was prepared for a dinner. A nice dinner, perhaps. A restaurant bill split among family members, perhaps. I was not prepared for what Vanessa had architected. I should have read the room the moment I walked in. The Holloway contingent occupied the far end of the long table, Gerald and Patricia Holloway, Vanessa's 2 sisters with their husbands, 3 sets of Holloway cousins, and a rotating cast of what I can only describe as Holloway associates, people who seem to exist primarily to affirm Gerald's opinions and laugh at the appropriate moments. On my side of the table were my brother Carl, his wife Denise, 2 of Marcus and my shared family friends, and my neighbor Helen, who had known Marcus since he was in diapers and cried every time she saw him because she said he looked exactly like Margaret. Marcus sat at the head of the table, glowing and happy, entirely oblivious, the way good-natured people often are when someone nearby is running a play. The dinner was extraordinary. I will give Vanessa that. The food was transcendent. The wine was exceptional. The jazz quartet played a version of a song Margaret used to hum while she cooked, and I had to excuse myself briefly after the 2nd course to stand in the hallway and collect myself, which I did, because I am a man who has had significant practice at collecting himself. By the time dessert arrived, a towering chocolate construction that looked more like architecture than food, I was relaxed. Genuinely relaxed. Marcus was happy. The wine had been good. Carl had made me laugh twice, which he can always do. I thought this was a good night. Then Vanessa stood up. She tapped her glass, waited for the room to quiet, and gave a toast. It was polished and warm on the surface, the way a painted wall looks warm until you realize the structure behind it is crumbling. She talked about Marcus's journey, his accomplishments, his capacity for love. She talked about how grateful she was to have built a life with him. She looked at her parents and thanked them for raising her to recognize a good man. She looked briefly in my direction and said, And of course, we're grateful for everyone who helped make Marcus who he is. Everyone who helped make Marcus who he is. Not his father, not Daniel, not the man who raised him alone after his mother died, who worked doubles for 3 years to keep the mortgage paid, who sat on the edge of a 14-year-old boy's bed and talked him through a grief neither of them had words for. Everyone gestured at like a category. I absorbed this, I refilled my wine glass, I applauded with the rest of the room. Then the check arrived. It was brought out on a silver tray by the maitre d', who placed it with great ceremony in the center of the table, directly in front of me, not in front of Vanessa, who had organized the evening, not in front of Gerald Holloway, who had been loudly implying wealth all night, in front of me. The number on the check, and I saw it clearly because my eyesight is still excellent, was $14,800, plus gratuity. The room didn't go silent immediately. It went silent in stages, like a wave moving backward from the check to the people nearest it, and then rippling outward to the far end of the table, until 53 people were very quietly looking at either the check or at me. Vanessa's smile arrived exactly on cue. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying that particular warmth that certain women deploy like a scalpel, "we thought, since you're always saying you want to do more for Marcus, this would be such a meaningful way to contribute to his special night. We thought," I noted the plural. I noted that Marcus, to his credit, looked confused, a confusion that I recognized as genuine because I know my son's face. "It's such a beautiful gesture," Patricia Holloway added from the far end, because apparently this was an ensemble production. Gerald said nothing. He just looked at me with the small, satisfied expression of a man watching a chess move land. I looked at the check, I looked at Vanessa, I looked at the 53 people waiting to see what Daniel Whitmore would do. Then I did what I have always done in the moments that matter. I took my time. I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew my reading glasses, not because I needed them for the check, I'd already seen the number perfectly well, but because deliberate slowness is its own kind of power. I put them on. I picked up the check. I appeared to examine it carefully for a long moment. Then I set it down, removed my glasses, folded them, returned them to my pocket, and looked directly at Vanessa. "I'd love to help," I said, and I smiled. "Let me make a call." The confusion that crossed her face was delicious. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected either embarrassed capitulation or defensive refusal, both of which she had prepared for. She had not prepared for "let me make a call." I stood, excused myself politely, and walked to the hallway. I was gone for 4 minutes. I know this because I counted. When I came back, I sat down, picked up my wine glass, and looked at Vanessa. "All taken care of," I said. "What do you mean?" she said. Her smile was still present, but had lost some structural integrity. "I called my accountant," I said. "I asked him to look into Calvea, this restaurant. As it turns out, I'm one of the silent investors in the restaurant group that owns this property, have been for about 9 years. I didn't even realize this was one of theirs until I saw the check." I watched her face. "I've arranged for the meal to be comped, all of it. The restaurant will consider it a private event hosted on the house, so there's no bill." The room was silent, genuinely, completely silent. The jazz quartet had taken a break between sets. Even the ambient sounds of the kitchen seemed to have paused. "You," Vanessa started. "Own a stake in the building you chose for the party," I said pleasantly. "Funny how things work out." Now I want to be precise here because I am a precise man. What I told the room was true. What I told the room was also incomplete, because the full story is slightly more than what I gave them in that moment, and the full story is what I want you to understand about what kind of man I am and what kind of evening this had actually been. Yes, I am a silent investor in a restaurant group. Yes, that group does have a stake in Calvea, but I had not arranged anything during those 4 minutes. What I had actually done was called a man named Robert Chen, who is my attorney and a very calm human being, and said, "Robert, I need you to look up the ownership structure of Calvea Restaurant and call me back in 3 minutes with whatever you find, and also I may need you to have a conversation with their management tonight." Robert called back in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, because he is excellent, confirmed the investment connection, and said, "Do you want me to make a call to their GM?" I said, "Please." By the time I sat back down at that table, Robert was already on the phone with the general manager of Calvea, referencing the investment group's standing relationship and asking, as a personal courtesy, that the evening be hosted for Mr. Whitmore's party. The GM, as it turned out, was entirely gracious about it. So when I said all taken care of, I was being accurate. It simply took a village. A village I had quietly assembled over 40 years of careful relationship building, honest investing, and treating people, all people, not just the ones who could do something for me, with respect. This is the part Vanessa didn't understand. She had looked at me and seen a quaint old man in a nice suit who could be publicly managed. She had not looked further. She had not asked herself how a man builds 3 companies, sustains generational wealth, and moves quietly through the world for 6 decades without accumulating a single meaningful enemy. The answer is carefully and with purpose. The check was gone. The room slowly returned to conversation, though it was a different conversation, lower, more careful, punctuated by glances at Vanessa and at me. Gerald Holloway caught my eye from across the table. His expression had changed. The small, satisfied chess move look was completely gone. In its place was something I recognized from boardrooms and negotiations, the recalibration of a man who has realized he misjudged the terrain. I raised my wine glass slightly in his direction. He raised his in return. We understood each other. Marcus came to me as people were saying their goodbyes. He hugged me the way he used to hug me when he was a teenager, pretending not to need hugs, tightly and without announcement. "Dad," he said quietly, "I didn't know about the check thing. I want you to know that." "I know," I said, "because I did." "She meant well," he said. "The way sons say things about their wives when they mean, 'Please don't make me choose.'" "Marcus," I said, "look at me." He looked at me, 40 years old. Margaret's eyes, my jaw, the best thing I ever made. "I had a wonderful evening," I said. "I'm glad I was here." He exhaled, "Yeah. Your mother would have loved that chocolate thing." He laughed, and it cracked slightly in the middle, the way his laugh does when he's trying not to cry. She really would have. We stood there for a moment in the emptying restaurant, in the wreckage and the warmth of the evening, and I thought about what it means to win something. Because I had one tonight, I knew that. The room knew it. Vanessa, gathering her clutch at the far end of the table with a face that had been carefully reassembled into pleasantness, knew it. But winning the way I won, quietly, completely, without cruelty, required a lifetime of preparation. It required the years of investment, the relationships tended, the reputation built stone by stone. It required being the kind of man who takes the long view, even when the short view would be satisfying. Vanessa had tried to reduce me to a wallet. She discovered instead that the wallet was attached to a man who had been building his life, quietly, purposefully, with love and without malice, since before she was born. I put on my coat. Carl appeared at my elbow and said, "Danny, I've been your brother for 62 years and tonight might be in the top 5. "Top 3, I said. He laughed all the way to the parking lot. I drove home through quiet streets, past the lights of a city I had lived in for most of my life, and I thought about Margaret, the way I always do on the nights that matter. I thought about what she would have said in the car on the way home, the two of us dissecting the evening the way we always had, her sharp and funny and seeing everything, me playing straight man to her commentary. She would have said something that made me laugh until I had to pull over. I miss that most, not the grand gestures, not the milestones, the car rides home. I pulled into my driveway, my quaint driveway, in front of my quaint house, and I sat for a moment with the engine off. Then I went inside, poured 2 fingers of the good whiskey, sat in the chair by the window where I can see the garden Margaret planted, and I felt something that I want to be honest about. Not triumph, not satisfaction in the way people mean when they say satisfaction. Something quieter, something that felt more like alignment, the feeling of having been exactly who I am, in the moment it mattered most, without apology and without aggression. Vanessa wanted to make me small. She made me remember exactly how large my life actually is. And that, I thought, as the whiskey did its work, and the garden sat silver in the moonlight, was the best birthday gift in the room. The check was for $14,800. I didn't pay $1 of it. And not one person at that table will ever make that mistake again.